Hi, good day. My name is Angel Shaga, and I will be tackling about the process-oriented performance-based assessment. But first, let's define performance-based assessment. Performance-based assessment is a measure of assessment based on the authentic task, such as activities, exercises, or problems that require students to show what they can do from what they have learned from the lesson. Some performance tasks are designed to have students demonstrate their understanding by applying their knowledge to a particular situation. So now let's talk about the process-oriented performance-based assessment. Process-oriented performance-based assessment is concerned with the actual task performance rather than the output or product of an activity. So it also evaluates the actual task performance, and it does not emphasize on the output or product of the activity. So we must take note that process-oriented performance-based assessment is concerned with the actual performance and not on the final output or product of an activity. This assessment aims to know what processes a person undergoes when given a task. We have here learning competencies in a process-oriented performance-based assessment. The learning objectives in process-oriented performance-based assessment are stated in direct observable behaviors of the students. Direct observation here means a teacher is able to monitor a learner's interaction inside the classroom. Competencies are defined as groups or cluster of skills and abilities needed for a particular task, like communication skills. So we have an example of learning competencies for process-oriented performance-based assessment. So the task here is to recite a poem by Edgar Allan Poe, The Raven. And the objectives: the activity aims to enable the students to recite a poem entitled The Raven by Edgar Allan Poe. And the objectives specifically: first is to recite the poem from memory without referring to notes. Second is use appropriate hand and body gestures in delivering the piece. Third is to maintain an eye contact with the audience while reciting the poem. Fourth is to create an ambience of the poem through appropriate rising and falling intonation. Fifth is to pronounce the words clearly and with proper diction. Notice that objectives started with the general statement of what is expected of the students or to the students from this task, which is to recite a poem, and it breaks down the general objectives to easily identify the learning competencies from this particular task. We should take note that the specific objectives identified constitute the learning competencies. So a competency is said to be more complex when it is consists of two or more skills. So we have here the simple and complex competencies. So let's talk about first the simple competencies. So we have a list of examples here. First is to speak with a well-modulated voice. Second is draw a straight line from one point to another point. And the third is color a leaf with a green crayon. So these examples are simple to do, and even a child can do this. So we also have here a list of examples of complex competencies. First is to recite a poem with feeling using appropriate voice quality, facial expressions, and hand gestures. Next is construct an equilateral triangle given three non-collinear points. The last is draw and color a leaf with green crayon. So the given examples here are way too difficult or complex compared to the simple competency, because in here students are not just tasked to speak in a well-modulated voice, but rather integrate a feeling, a voice quality, facial expressions, and hand gestures. Same as for the second and third example, Here in the simple competencies, it is simple task. But when we read here on the complex competencies, it is way more difficult than the simple competencies. Okay, so next is task designing in a process-oriented performance-based assessment. So learning tasks used to be carefully planned. So in particular, the teacher must ensure that the particular learning process to be observed contributes to the overall understanding of the subject or course. So some generally accepted standards for designing a task includes first, identifying an activity that would highlight the competencies to be evaluated. So in choosing activity, you have to identify if there are competencies that are found in that activity that you want to evaluate from your students. So for example, reciting a poem, writing an essay, or manipulating the microscope. Second is identifying an activity that would entail more or less the same sets of competencies. If an activity would result in too many possible competencies, then the teacher would have difficulty assessing students' competency on the task. So next is find a task that would be interesting and enjoyable for the students. So it is very important to find a task that would catch your students' interest to make learning more fun and memorable. Next is scoring rubric in a process-oriented performance-based assessment. So rubric is a scoring scale used to assess student performance along task-specific set of criteria. It contains the essential criteria for the task, and appropriate levels of performance is typically created to measure students' performance. So, scoring rubric is important for assessing performance to have a proof or a basis on why a student got that particular score during a performance. And scoring rubric help the students, teachers, and parents to identify what quality work is, and for the students, they can judge their own performance based from the rubric. And for the teacher, it will easily explain why a student got a certain score. So, for example, the following rubric or the scoring scale covers the actual performance of the task in an English class. So, a rubric is comprised with two components. These are the criteria and levels of performance. Criteria here, according to NIU, it identify the trait, feature, or dimension which is to be measured and include a definition and example to clarify the meaning of each trait being assessed. On the other hand, levels of performance, according to NIU, determine the degree of performance which has been met and will provide for consistent and objective assessment and better feedback to students. So these levels tell students what they are expected to do. So next is descriptors. So it spells out what is expected of students at each level of performance for each criterion. It tells students more precisely what performance looks like at each level and how their work might be distinguished from the work of others for each criterion. So descriptors help the teachers more precisely and consistently distinguish between student work. So descriptors gives an overlook on how they are going to do a task or portray a task. So the examples of descriptors are given below. Those words that are highlighted and at the same time italicized are the descriptors. So why include levels of performance? So for clear expectation, students know what is expected of them and teachers know what to look for in students' performance. So students will be able to know what are the expected to them, and teachers will know also what to look for the students' performance. Next is for more consistent and objective assessment. So levels of performance permit teacher to more consistently and objectively distinguish between good and bad performance or between superior, mediocre, and poor performance when evaluating student work. Next is for better feedback. So identifying levels of performance allows teacher to provide more detailed feedback to students. So because of this, students and teachers are able to know what are the strengths and weaknesses for them to improve what they have to improve. So that's all for process-oriented performance-based assessment, and thank you for listening.